Welcome to Midweek Mysteries, and thank you for being here. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. We appreciate all of you for listening, and of course, a big thank you goes out to our supporters on Patreon and on buymeacoffee.com. If you're new to the show, Midweek Mysteries is a shorter version of our full-length Sunday episodes, where we also enjoy giving a personal shout-out to our newest supporters, so please be sure to tune in. Today's first Midweek Mystery comes to us from Alysa. Alysa says, "Hello. I enjoy your podcast and all things spooky. I wanted to share my story. I would be happy to tell it and my other stories on the podcast as well. It's a long one, so I will do my best not to write you a whole novel. So my story starts from birth. I was the first grandchild, and my dad's side of the family is very Irish and come with all the general superstitions regarding spirits. My grandmother on the other side had a ghost friend that she called Red. He had been with her since childhood, basically an imaginary friend who never left. When I was born, being the first grandchild, Red was apparently very excited. He loved to hang around me and scare the living daylights out of my mother. The house my family lived in was very haunted to begin with, and my mom and dad had the misfortune of living in the shoddily finished part of the basement. When I was born, I was lucky, and my nursery was upstairs. My mom would routinely be home alone late into the night while my dad and grandfather worked. One particular night, she had put me to bed and then went downstairs to settle in herself. At some point in the night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps going up and down the basement stairs. She looked at the clock, and it was still too early for my dad to be home, so she started to panic, thinking someone had broken in. She grabbed a baseball bat and snuck upstairs, hoping to protect me from the intruder. As she reached the top of the steps, she heard a sound that made her stop. It was baby me laughing. She rushed to my room, flung the door open to find me in my crib, laughing, with every single toy in my room going off. She knew immediately that it was Red. The next morning, she called my grandmother and told her to come and get her damn ghost. The next adventure my mother had with Red probably cost her a few years off of her life. It was the first winter storm of my life. I was a June baby. There was a blizzard outside, and again, my mom was home alone. Only this time, it's the middle of the day. My mom had placed me in the middle of the bed with a barrier of pillows around me to keep me from rolling off while she was just doing some cleaning. She hadn't left me alone long, but went to check in on me and have a break. When she entered the room, she found me missing from the bed. She freaked out. The baby fell off the bed, she thought, and she tried frantically searching the bed and floor, but I wasn't there. She pulled all the covers off the bed. I wasn't there either. Someone must have come in and taken me, she thought. She called out to see if someone had come home. She was alone, and she ran from room to room and didn't find me. She ran outside and around the house in the blizzard. The only prints in the snow were from her. I had disappeared. She called my dad and he rushed home. In a panic, they both searched and even upended the bed, looking for me. I wasn't there. Someone had taken me, they thought. They went and grabbed the phone to call the police and walked back into the bedroom. They reached the room before the phone connected, and they found me. I was lying there on the upended bed, laughing. My mom's last experience with Red happened at a family reunion in Tennessee. My mother and father were sleeping on an air mattress in my aunt's newly renovated attic. It had one of those big, classic Southern-style bay windows with a seat in the room. My mom woke up the first night to find my dad sitting on the window seat, staring out the window. "Dwayne, come back to bed," she called. He turned to look at her, then seemingly ignored her and looked back out the window. "Come back to bed," she called again, but no response this time. She decided, oh well, let him look out the window then, and she rolled over to get comfortable. When she rolled over, she came face to face with the sleeping form of my father. She tells me that she's never flipped over faster in her life. She looked back at the window, and my dad was no longer there. The next morning, she was talking with my grandmother, and she asked her, I never thought to ask, But what does red look like? My grandmother laughed and said, "It was the weirdest thing, but Red looked exactly like Dwayne, my father. That is why she named him Red. My father and Red both have red hair." This story was one of the ones that always creeped me out the most. I have never seen Red, but when I think back on the memories from my childhood, I can't help but wonder, was it always my father in those memories? Or was it Red? I wish I could say that the story of Red was the last experience I had with spirits, but unfortunately, I have found myself to be a bit of an albeit unwilling medium. When I was around 3, as far as I can remember, we were still living in the house, and I had been moved to the creepy basement with my parents. My parents had me when they were young, and they weren't the best at parenting. When it was bedtime, or they would have parties, they would put me downstairs alone and lock the basement door. Countless times I would cry at the door, terrified, and they would just turn up their music and ignore me. That being said, it's not that surprising that I would have terrible night terrors. I would sit awake in the middle of the bed with the covers around me, and wolves would come from the sliding basement door and circle the bed, snarling and snapping at dark shadows that would circle outside them. I was terrified, but my parents would tell me it was nightmares. After a while, we moved to a new town and a new house, and the terrors would change as I grew older. Scary things I'd seen in movies, like Freddy Krueger, would melt out of my wall or stand in my doorway staring at me. I was always too scared to stay in my own bed. Eventually, I grew out of the night terrors, and instead picked up the lovely habit of sleepwalking. Many times I would wake up in other rooms of my house, confused. This was made all the more unsettling by the fact that I slept on the top bunk of my bed. I would still see shadows and stuff at night, and out of the corner of my eyes, but I was pretty used to them by now. Eventually, the sleepwalking stopped as well, around the age of 12, and instead became insomnia. Outside of my poor sleep habits, the creepiest experience I had in my youth happened at my childhood friend's home. She had told me early on at one of her first sleepovers that she didn't like the bathroom in her home and that it was creepy. The bathroom in her home was located in her room. The house was fairly old, and the bathroom was the kind with a clawfoot tub and a large, thick door that had 2 locks on it. A big turning deadbolt-type lock and one of the swinging latch hook types. There was a cabinet high up in one corner that creeped her out. She said it was almost impossible to open, but every morning they would find the cabinet wide open. When I went in the bathroom the first time, I got the creepiest vibes from it. It didn't feel comfortable. It felt like someone was watching you, which is the opposite of what you want in a bathroom. She also told me that at night she would hear heavy breathing. She used to share a room with her older sister and blamed the breathing on her, but by this time, her older sister had gone away to college, and she would still hear the breathing. I made a point to never stay there at night. I would only stay at her house once a year for her birthday, and that was only because we would camp out in a tent in her yard. One day, in the middle of summer, we had just walked to her house from the public pool. We were around 13 at the time, and we were both in her bathroom cleaning up from the pool. She was sitting on the toilet, and I was looking in the mirror brushing out my hair, when all of a sudden, the big old heavy bathroom door violently slammed shut. I jumped and turned, landing with my butt in the sink, and we both watched as the deadbolt on the inside of the door slammed into the locking position, and the latch hook swung into the locked position. Now at this point, from my position perched on the sink, I immediately ran through all of the options of why that could have logically happened. Maybe someone was home and they slammed the door, but no one was home. Possibly a breeze or the air conditioning blew the door shut, but the windows were closed and the AC didn't blow near the door. Plus, the door was oversized and heavy. I could rationalize the door closing, but I couldn't rationalize the door locking us in right in front of our eyes. My friend and I looked at each other in terror and silently agreed that we had to get out of the bathroom. We rushed to the door and unlocked it and threw it open. We dashed out into the living room and pressed ourselves into the corner of the room, staring at the doorway to her room and the bathroom. As we stared in silence, her dog walked out of her mother's room and looked at us like we were crazy. She proceeded to continue until she reached the doorway to the bathroom, and then she suddenly stopped and turned to the opening, growling and foaming at the mouth. She fell to the ground in a seizure, and my friend and I lost it, screaming and crying. Her dog ended up being okay, but from that day on, she wound up having a seizure problem. My friend continued to have many more instances with this ghost, including it stalking her and calling her. As for myself, I have many more stories I can tell, but for now, I will just give you a highlight. If you are needing some spooky true stories, I'd be happy to tell them. Best, Alysa. Our next midweek mystery comes from Sarah. Sarah's story is called My Favorite Spooky Story. Sarah says, Hi, Nick. I started listening to your podcast on some recent road trips, and now I'm hooked. I don't have any spooky stories or experiences of my own, but I'm always asking others for theirs, and this is my favorite one that I've heard. After I graduated college in 2015, I began working at an elementary school in Florida. After a few months, I noticed that the clock in my office would need to be reset every single day, despite fixing it the evening before. Without any spooky suspicions, I brought this up to the school guidance counselor, who I befriended. I was only simply annoyed by the clock, but she admittedly told me that it was the ghosts at the school. Of course, I asked for more details, and she proceeded to tell me one of her experiences. She said that one day she arrived at the school early in the morning, around 5 a.m., to set up for a morning meeting in the basement. No one else was there at the time, not even the custodians. As she was setting up the chairs around the meeting table, she noticed that the nice leather chair that went at the head of the table was missing. Since this was an important meeting, she needed the chair and searched the entire basement for it. It was nowhere to be found. She decided to go back upstairs and look in some of the classrooms and main office, but with no luck, she headed back down to the basement to find a different chair to use. As she arrived back in the basement, the leather chair she was looking for was sitting in the doorway of the basement meeting room, propping the door open. She took another look around the school to double-check and confirmed that no one else was there. She later told me that the school was built in the 1920s, and there had been a fire there at one of the houses up the street. She believed that the family who died in that fire haunts the school and helped her find the chair. Not the most exciting story, but I love it because it reminds me of my first job. I'm so glad I found your podcast. Please keep it up. Can't wait for the next episode. Sarah. Our next midweek mystery comes to us from Lucy. Lucy says, Hi. I just found your podcast the other day, and I've been enjoying it. I love anything mysterious or conspiracy. It's the best way to pass my day at work. Anyway, I just wanted to share a quick story with you, and if you want to share it on your show, that's great. I had a niece living with me for a while, and she is a pretty dark person. She has an entity that follows her around. She had told me that this thing followed her to my house, and I believe that it had. One morning, my 5-year-old saw it in our room. She awoke around the time the sun is just starting to come up and light through the windows. She leapt to the other side of the bed and started screaming, absolutely terrified, saying, I don't like it, Mama. I'm scared. This went on for a minute or so, until I got out of the bed, throwing my arms about the area. I myself never saw anything, but I do believe that she did, and it was not her imagination. The sound of terror in her voice and the look in her eyes was very real. My niece has since moved out. I sage my house periodically now, and she helps me sometimes, and we have not seen or felt anything since. Our last midweek mystery of tonight comes from Joseph. Joseph's story is called Haunted Apartment. Joseph says, Hello there. I recently discovered your podcast, and I have a story I would like to share. My apartment has something haunting it, or rather, I think something attached to it. I moved in around May of 2012. My first experience was small things at first. I would see shadows flit around the corners. I would feel a heavy presence even when my roommate was gone. I remember reading in my room one night. I have rope lights hung around the room so I can have a nice, comfortable glow to read before bed, rather than a harsh lamp. I was interrupted by my door creaking open. I had thought that it was shut tightly, but didn't think much of it, at least until the heavy presence started to fill my room. I should state that all my life I have been sensitive to these things, even as a baby, or so my mother and aunt tell me. So over time, I've learned to trust my instincts. In this particular moment, I felt not only the presence, but the feeling of being watched as well. I watched a shadow form by my door and just stare at me. It was eerily hypnotizing to watch this thing. Suddenly, a crash from the living room broke me out of my trance. I went to check it out and found that the shelf above our TV had been knocked down. My first assumption was that one of our roommate's cats had tried to jump on it and it fell off the wall. At this point, my roommate was home, so I knocked on the door to let him know. He said, "Come on in," and both cats walked out. So it was not the cats that had knocked the shelf off the wall. My next big experience was a year or two later. My roommate had moved out, and my girlfriend moved in. Also, my sister and her boyfriend were temporarily staying with me until their own place opened at the start of the next month. My girlfriend picked me up from work, and as I went to open my door, it was locked. I rarely lock my door, but as I tried to push the door open, I heard a thump from the other side, as if something had been knocked over. Then I heard running footsteps and a door slam. As I entered the living room, the recliner was swaying, as if someone had just jumped up, and the fan was lying face down on the floor. I assumed my sister and her boyfriend were being intimate in my living room. I banged on their door and yelled at them for it. I got no reply and heard nothing inside. A few minutes later, I knocked on their door again and got no response, so I opened up the door and nobody was there. I called and asked where they were, and my sister said they were staying at a friend's house for the weekend. My girlfriend freaked out. I blessed the house that night and followed up with a ritual smudging. For a few months, it seemed to work. Until one night, my girlfriend shakes me awake, yelling at me to stop what I was doing. Groggily, I asked her what she's talking about. She said that I was sitting up and staring at her, chanting in some weird, unrecognizable language. I had zero recollection of this, even to this day. We went back to sleep, following which I had some terrifying nightmares. I never have nightmares, but as I began to slowly wake up from one, I opened my eyes and saw a darker-than-dark silhouette standing above me with glowing dark green eyes. I sat up, abruptly awake and shocked, and I yelled out in surprise. My girlfriend jumped awake from my shout and saw immediately the shadow next to me in the room, and she screamed, and suddenly, almost as if it was smoke, the entity evaporated. I immediately got up and drove my girlfriend to my parents' house so she could stay the rest of the night. I drove back after dropping her off and spent the next few hours blessing the place again with holy water and anointing the door with holy oil, as well as performing another full smudging ritual. I said multiple prayers over and over again. It finally seemed to work. Since then, I have not experienced anything as intense or terrifying. A few footsteps here and there, but that's about it. I've done research on the property and couldn't find anything bad. No deaths, etc. So this leads me to believe that it was either me or my girlfriend that has something attached. I'm led to believe that it's me, since I've apparently had an affinity for the supernatural ever since I was a baby. Either way, it was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. Sorry for the long story, but thank you for listening. I hope you are well and staying safe during these times. As we come to the end of this edition of Midweek Mysteries, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the podcast, and a special thank you to Alicia, Sarah, Lucy, and Joseph for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember, no matter how insignificant or bizarre you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. If you're interested in supporting the show, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. You can also become a patron by visiting patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Benefits include ad-free shows and early access to select episodes. Or if you prefer to make a simple one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. However you choose to support the show, just know that we appreciate it. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy rest of the week, and we'll see you back here on Sunday with our next full-length episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.